Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor, Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hey, Judah.
And WPR associate editor, Prachi Vidwans. Hi, Prachi.
Hi, Judah.
We'll be talking about the major global issues that have been overshadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic, but which have not diminished in importance or urgency. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Chris Sabatini about Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro's disastrous response to the coronavirus pandemic, as well as several other scandals closing in on Bolsonaro and his family. Freddy, Prachi, we've been understandably focused on the coronavirus pandemic for the past several months now. Both on the website as well as on the podcast. Doing my morning news scan and reading, it sometimes feels like nothing else is actually going on in the world. But of course, that's not the case. So I thought today, given that, again, we seem to be in a holding pattern in a lot of ways in terms of the actual pandemic and pandemic response, that we could discuss some of those other issues that will reemerge in all their urgency once the pandemic has become either less acute or more manageable. So with that in mind, Freddie, why don't you kick things off? What's something that comes to your mind, an issue that has been overshadowed because of all the coverage of the pandemic, but that hasn't gone away and that we're going to have to deal with?
It's a pretty big issue, war and conflict, to put it broadly. And more specifically, things like Syria's civil war, the war in Yemen as well, conflict zones specifically, in parts of the Middle East that usually dominate headlines. Although the dynamic of Syria's civil war for the last few years at least is that it's been receding from headlines, even though the war is not over and is entering. It seems like at least it's been entering this next stage or end game for a while now. And I think that just in terms of coverage, wars like that are going to be overshadowed. I can't even really recall a headline from Syria that I've read, since the pandemic started, except a recent one about signs of some tension within the Assad regime. But I think the bigger issue is that, there was an effort early on from the UN to try to declare a global ceasefire and to sort of use the crisis of the pandemic to at least put a freeze on conflict around the world, get countries at the UN to agree to halt fighting, as we have seen since then, and as Richard Gowan and Ashish Pradhan wrote this week in WPR, that resolution at the Security Council has really gone nowhere. And it's just a sign, I think, that on the one hand, war and conflict is going to be sort of forgotten or overshadowed by the pandemic, but also pre-existing problems, the inability of the UN, for example, to cooperate and try to resolve conflicts is actually just probably going to get worse as the pandemic goes on.
Another one that comes to mind is in Libya, where the fighting continued with maybe a brief pause. But in any case, doesn't seem to be letting up at all. I have to admit, it flabbergasts me in a lot of ways to see these conflicts carrying on, when for me, like the weekly shopping trip is like a logistical challenge. And every time I pass someone on a footpath who's jogging by, I'm wondering if they're giving me the virus. Just the thought that people are still going to war and shooting at each other under these circumstances is a little mind-boggling to me. But of course, the factors and the interests that are driving these conflicts don't disappear because of the pandemic. In Syria in particular, it's true what you said in terms of it almost seems like an endless endgame where the ultimate outcome seems pretty self-evident at this point in terms of the Assad regime coming out on top of the civil war, but there's still all this maneuvering going on the ground, particularly now. Really, it seems like the last outside player besides Russia and Iran is Turkey, because it doesn't look like the United States is terribly interested in the end game or the diplomatic end game. But even there, once some of those aspects are resolved, or rather once the fighting resolves some of those final issues, there's still going to be the enormous challenge of reconstruction in Syria, and then when you think of Yemen or Libya, the same sort of enormous challenges. So the pandemic almost doesn't. Obviously, it does change a lot there, but the kind of challenges those countries faced post-conflict were enormous already, and they're only going to become worse.
Exactly. It's hard to really imagine, if we could even call it reconstruction or whatever, the next stage of Syria's war is going to be. As I've written before, and have still, tried to follow closely, at least the moves by the regime to claim that the war is being won or is over and that we can now talk about reconstruction. They were already maneuvering to sort of make that another stage of the war to, reconsolidate regime control. And if anything, sort of rebuild the country in Assad's image. The idea of imagining all those problems already, and then now in the context of the coronavirus, is it's hard to imagine. And this is already, saying this knowing very little about the pandemic's impact in Syria, because there's very little reporting, obviously, and we just have a very limited view of what impact the virus is actually having there now.
It also, to me, really highlights also some of the just egregious humanitarian and international law violations in the war, particularly in Syria, but also in Yemen, where, for instance, hospitals have been targeted and medical units have been targeted, and it just really underscores when the pandemic hits, just the degree to which, in addition to being against international law and inhumane, it just weakens a country's ability to show any sort of resilience in the face of a medical crisis and health crisis like the pandemic. And of course, in conflict zones, there are all sorts of health crises as well, in terms of susceptibility to infections and things like that, insanitary conditions and hunger, etc. So to me, it just further underscores the importance of a lot of issues that don't necessarily get a lot of traction, even at the height of a conflict or at the height of a crisis, but that when we face, on top of that, the pandemic just gets exacerbated even more. Prachi, do you want to jump in?
I guess something that comes to mind is that there's been a pretty big variance, it seems, in how non-state actors have responded to the coronavirus, where some have seemed to shift to a service provision mode of, encouraging people in communities that they control to wear masks and things like that, whereas others are just completely ignoring it and carrying out their, regular attacks pretty much as if the pandemic is not happening. So it's kind of interesting to think also how the pandemic will shift the interests of these groups as time goes on. Like, what comes to mind is the crash in oil prices. Like, what's going to happen to some of these armed groups that rely on oil for their own illicit income. As much as conflict is continuing under the radar, I think the pandemic will also shift some of these dynamics in interesting ways in the next couple of months.
It's a good point. We ran a briefing, I believe last week, maybe the week before, on Somalia and Al-Shabaab, and how Al-Shabaab is really in a denialist mode with regard to the pandemic. And that contrasts with the Taliban in Afghanistan, which had been trying to adopt a sort of gravitas and adopt the position of governance in the territories it controlled with regard to providing healthcare and countering the pandemic. Of course, that sort of got shattered this week with the horrific attack against a maternity clinic. And it's hard to know in terms of the chain of command who was responsible, or whether that was something that was ordered from up top. It certainly clashes with the image and the message that they had seemed to be trying to portray. But then again, as you said, Prachi, another one that comes to mind in addition to oil that is often pirated and hijacked by insurgencies to fund to arm themselves and fund their insurgencies. Another is the illicit trade in drugs and narcotics, which is also another major source of income for certain insurgencies. And as Benoit Gomis wrote for us a few weeks ago as well, the pandemic is having an impact on that as well. So that could too, as you said, have an effect on the ability of various non-state actors to continue carrying out their operations and their insurgencies.
Yeah, and listening to some of the concerns you guys brought about as well about, how civilians will be affected, I think it brings up a theme that I'm sure is going to come up a lot in this podcast, which is just the value of global attention. So there are a lot of issues that are developing during the pandemic when people are not paying attention because they're distracted by, the very serious health consequences in their own countries. So how does the lack of global attention shift how actors respond? Like, does it affect their strategy? Does it mean that some of these issues are just going to languish, or that, crimes will go unpunished
and unaddressed by the international community? Yeah.
Just to add to what Prachi was saying, I think the other concern about attention is also, there was already enough trouble as it was to, raise awareness about humanitarian needs, and especially the money to address them, whether that was, to support refugees or to support, famine in Yemen, some of the, very urgent humanitarian issues, Judah, that you were referring to, that, predate the pandemic. And now, given the economic impacts and given the need to, all the money that's going to be needed to address the pandemic in any country, any particular country, there's probably going to be even less money to support international organizations like the UN or, humanitarian relief. And so I think that just wider impact will be felt in the years to come.
Prachi, which issue right now going on that's getting overshadowed by the pandemic did you want to address?
So I wanted to discuss this report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that was released on March 1st, so just before a lot of countries started imposing lockdowns across the West. So this report found that the Chinese government has facilitated the mass transfer of Uyghur and ethnic minority detainees from Xinjiang to factories across China. Xinjiang, as you know, is a province in China's west. It's also known as East Turkestan, where Uyghurs, a predominantly Muslim ethnic minority, have long been subjected to a campaign of what activists call cultural genocide, so gross violations of their human rights. But it's ramped up dramatically in recent years to the point where at least 1 million Uyghurs, people suspect that it's actually many more Uyghurs, are now detained in concentration camps. This report basically found that detainees have been moved from these camps to factories along the supply chains of at least 83 major global brands, including Apple, BMW, Gap, Huawei, Nike, Samsung, Sony, Volkswagen. So it's a pretty huge story that so many of these brands have slavery in their supply chains. And, the report came out just before the pandemic. It did raise a lot of attention at the time. And, luckily it seems that policymakers are paying attention to it. But this is exactly the kind of issue that would need kind of a upswelling of criticism and anger from the public to really move the needle on it. And I think some of these companies have kind of escaped scrutiny to an extent because attention has been elsewhere.
I'll say something that might be counterintuitive or might not be. I think this is the kind of issue that, as the pandemic wanes, will actually become more salient because and we talked about this a couple weeks ago with regard to the U.S.-China relationship. But I believe that China's human rights record is going to be, even if it's instrumentalized and even if it's opportunistic on the part of the United States, I think it's going to become a much more prominent part of the conversation, certainly pressed by Washington in terms of relations with China and economic relations with China, and with the possibility of, for instance, in the same way that there's transparency in supply chains for diamonds, to prevent what they call blood diamonds or diamonds that are used to finance conflict. I believe there might be some calls for transparency in the labor supply chain in China, as part of the pressure campaign on China in the aftermath of the pandemic. So I actually think that while it might be overshadowed now by the pandemic, that to begin with, it might actually become more prominent should Washington and the Trump administration need more pressure points in the sort of battle of messaging over the pandemic, and certainly after the pandemic will return to prominence and might even take a more prominent position in American policymaking and perhaps in European as well.
That would be a great outcome. I think for the most part, advocates have focused on requiring companies to ensure that there's no human rights abuse along the supply chain. So California has a really good law about this that has pushed companies to look into this a bit more and take it more seriously. But I guess what you're suggesting is that potentially during Trump's campaign, as pressure ramps up on China, the onus will be put on the Chinese government itself to regulate and be more transparent, which is, I mean, forgive me for being a bit cynical. I don't know how much we could trust Chinese data even in that circumstance, but it would be a kind of effective approach if it worked.
I don't think necessarily that it will change China's behavior or policy. But it will probably be a more cynical use of human rights and the human rights plank as part of this messaging battle with China. And of course, China, given how prickly it's been in terms of the pandemic, and just in terms of its response, its diplomatic responses more recently in general, I would expect it to just lead to a further deterioration in relations rather than necessarily improvement on the ground for Uyghurs. But to the extent that it is in the spotlight, to whatever extent that might mitigate or constrain Chinese behavior just for PR purposes, it might have an effect. But I would be not necessarily skeptical, but less hopeful for that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised also if, to bring it back to the issue of war and conflict as well, that, if the U.S. is going to, go after China more aggressively, on any number of issues, whether it's, the pandemic response or trade or highlighting human rights abuses against the Uyghurs, if it's done in the context of, what Trump is doing to try to distract from the disaster here in the U.S., that's also going to have carryover effects over dealing with war and conflict in issues like Syria and some of the problems that the UN Security Council in particular was already pretty dysfunctional in terms of trying to resolve before the coronavirus hit. And if there's just heightened tension between the US and China, that's going to make the Security Council even more dysfunctional.
It's a great point. In general, over the past 5 years or so, with regard to Syria in particular, the blockage has been between the U.S. and Russia. China, to the extent that it sides with Russia, usually uses Russia as cover to do so. But China has been gaining influence in the UN and other multilateral institutions and has become a little more assertive in terms of its messaging. And so if those tensions over the Uyghurs and the pandemic really become front and center in U.S.-China relations, you could expect to see China no longer hiding behind Russia, but actually countering the U.S. at the Security Council outright in its own right. But again, to my mind, it also, between both of these topics, they really highlight how difficult it is to strike the balance in terms of drawing certain lines with regard to human rights, for instance, and conflict, as well as balancing interests, and then also maintaining diplomatic channels for cooperation where it's necessary. And so the degree to which that necessary cooperation over conflict has broken down shows how difficult it is to strike that balance, and how dangerous it is. And again, I don't want to bring everything back to Trump, but how simplistic the America First message is, and how simplistic the idea that America can just pound its fist on the table and everyone else will fall into line. It doesn't work that way. And to really achieve meaningful progress on any of these issues is very complicated and complex in a system, in international institutions where where different powers have veto powers, and in a global order and global system where there's a lot of interrelated parts and interdependencies.
I mean, I think a crisis like this, if the pandemic has made anything clear, it's that it's just underscored problems that plagued, other crises before. The inability to deal with the civil war in Syria, or the inability to have a coordinated response to Europe's refugee crisis 4 or 5 years ago. Any of the major crises that we've, seen over the last few years, the inability of countries to cooperate to deal with them, this has just, put all that under even brighter lights. And I think that the problem is, if countries, turn inward and take the response that we've seen from the U.S. under Trump and from China, of trying to sort of make this hyper-nationalist and to criticize, to distract from your own failures, that's just going to make cooperation even less likely. And so, all these problems that were around before the coronavirus hit, and are probably going to be even worse after it recedes, whenever that is, will be even less equipped to deal with them.
Prachi, it's got to be pretty demoralizing for activists advocating for the Uyghur cause. The concentration camps that you mentioned have been going on for at least the last couple of years. They've gotten attention. They've been mentioned. They've gotten headlines. There've been a couple high-profile leaks of documents and from the Chinese government that were somewhat damning. And at the same time, it seems like there was never really that much traction. And then this report comes up that really pins a lot of the, if not the blame, at least a certain amount of responsibility on major global brands. And if there's one thing that tends to generate action, it's when global brands feel like their bottom line might get threatened by the optics of what's going on. And right when that happens, there's this global pandemic that completely moves the spotlight and takes the heat off. It's got to be pretty demoralizing.
Yeah, I think that, I've had several conversations with Uyghur activists throughout the years, and it's always been a question that comes up, is how do we get people to care about this? Because for whatever reason, this issue of Uyghur detention and cultural genocide just hasn't really risen to the level of, general public discourse. And it's definitely been a struggle. I think that during this pandemic, it's also really highlighting just the lack of information about what's going on in Xinjiang and in these detention centers. Uyghurs in exile are really concerned about what might be happening to family members. I mean, oftentimes their brother, sister, dad will disappear, and they just assume that they're in detention centers because, for the most part, they don't have any record of what's become of them. And now they're in a situation where, you assume that there have been breakouts in these camps. And I think the Chinese government has confirmed something like 100 cases. And so you assume that the coronavirus has reached there, but you can't really know what's going on. I guess I would be hopeful that some of this will come out, in at least that, as U.S.-China tensions rise, rhetoric will bring more attention to this issue, but it's pretty grim. It has been grim for years.
The topic that I've got my eye on is migration. Obviously, it's been a huge and salient political issue in Europe since the refugee crisis that you mentioned, Freddy, and as well as in the U.S. On the southern border with Mexico and from the Central American Northern Triangle countries. And I guess I think that the problem is not going to go away after the pandemic, but I believe that the pandemic will actually have an enormous impact on it, because I think we're looking at a possible, if not likely, scenario of a lot of reverse migration due to the economic contraction in the developed economies, something we saw after the global financial crisis, when a lot of people who had migrated to hot economies in the developed world, because there was such a hit on jobs, turned around and went back home to wait it out there. There's going to be a drop-off. There already is a drop-off in remittances, and that's likely to continue. And then it'll also be exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the developed countries that, even if aid and development budgets have gone down, they've still provided a certain amount of aid and development, especially to address some of the push factors for migration. And those countries are going to be really hard hit by the economic fallout of the pandemic. So with regard to reconstruction in Syria, we already mentioned that. But I think that also the kind of aid and development support that's been going to some of the out-migration countries is going to dry up. And so I think that there might be an odd sort of dynamic where the pressure in terms of European and American politics of the anti-immigrant grievances and political parties might diminish, because I think that the economic hardship will be just more broadly distributed, and migration might actually go down a little bit, if not, and perhaps even significantly. And at the same time, I think that the conditions in the countries of origin are likely to become much, much worse when it's a question of poverty, hunger, instability, and no release valve in terms of the out-migration that used to siphon off at least some of the people that might be in those conditions. And so I think it all adds up for a pretty dark forecast in the countries of origin and in general.
It's hard to imagine where people will try to go, migrants, thinking, for example, of Central America, if those countries are hit as badly as it looks like they could be by the pandemic, and then, as you mentioned, but there's less of an appeal in coming to the U.S., where would they go? I still think that probably, even though, the economic impact here in the U.S. is going to be devastating also, and I think you can look at Europe the same way, that they won't look like places where there is as much appeal perhaps to go and get a job and send remittances home. It's still going to be better, or it's going to look better than a developing country that doesn't have the capacity to deal with the pandemic at all. So I think that you could still see large flows of migrants and refugees effectively, and just even less of an infrastructure to deal with them.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Freddie. I saw a news story today in the Washington Post that says that amid the coronavirus crisis, the Trump administration has shut U.S. immigration systems to such an extent that only 2 people have been granted asylum since March. So I think that it's possible that countries will admit fewer and fewer migrants, and also that they'll return more and more migrants at borders, as has already been happening, because of fears of outbreaks at detention centers and migrant camps. So yeah, I would echo your prediction that although migrants might be interested in coming to more prosperous countries, it might be harder and harder for them to actually get in.
There's also the question of the transit countries, and the ways in which borders are being more tightly policed, and also the hostility and animosity and fear and suspicion of people traveling through at this point anywhere. A lot of these migrant trails, if you will, pass through smaller villages. They pass through countries where the language might be a common language, but the accents are different. It's clear when someone is an outsider. It's clear when someone is passing through. And so I think that there might be a lot more hostility along the way as well, that would make the trip even more forbidding than it already is, and make the people who choose to take it even more vulnerable. So it's possible, Freddie, as you said too, that the conditions will be so dire in the countries of origin that people will still try to make that trip. And at the same time, as you said, Prachi, the doors will in all likelihood be even more firmly closed. But in either instance, no matter what how the scenario plays out, again, it's a crisis or a challenge and a problem that wasn't addressed collectively in any effective way, whether in Europe or in the Americas, and now is only going to be exacerbated by the pandemic, and take on all the same kinds of urgencies and in possibly new configurations and iterations. So again, like all three of the topics that we mentioned, overshadowed and exacerbated by the pandemic. All right, time to highlight some WPR articles for everyone listening. Freddie, which one did you have in mind?
Frida Giddis's column this week on Sweden's approach to the pandemic, the quote-unquote Swedish model, has gotten a lot of coverage. Sweden adopted far less stringent restrictions. It's basically, in some ways, an idea of herd immunity. And initially, it looked like it was working very well. But as Frida points out, especially compared to other Scandinavian countries, like Denmark, which followed the more traditional route of lockdowns, they're now easing lockdowns as their case counts and deaths trend downward, and Sweden's case counts and number of deaths are going up. So Frida warns that obviously the story is still unfolding, but it is increasingly looking like Sweden's approach may be more of a failure than a panacea.
And Prachi?
I wanted to mention this week's feature by Francis Wade on how COVID-19 might give Myanmar's military an opportunity to grow its power and support ahead of the country's 2020 elections later this year. So Myanmar had an election in 2015 that saw a huge win for the former democratic hero Aung San Suu Kyi and her party. But since then, Francis explains that Suu Kyi has failed to deliver on her campaign promises, especially her promises to the country's ethnic minorities who have been caught in the middle of an armed conflict or multiple armed conflicts for half a century. So this campaign season, Francis says she will have to prove that she can offer more hope for these groups than the military can. But, he writes, her party's bid to centralize control of the border regions via the ceasefires, coupled with its defense of the military's brutal campaign against the Rohingya, has brought into sharp focus the ethno-nationalist ideology that, with growing nakedness, shapes the party's view of what the country should look like going forward.
And I'll mention William Mosley's briefing on the food security crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic, or perhaps more accurately, the food security crises, as Bill explains that the pandemic's impact is being felt differently in developed economies and emerging economies. The problem for wealthier countries is mainly one of food supply because their complex and concentrated food supply chains make them vulnerable to the spread of the pandemic. In contrast, emerging countries will face problems of food access because their weaker social safety nets will be hard-pressed by the economic fallout from the pandemic. The looming crisis comes at a bad time in terms of broader trends. As Bill writes, quote, "While global hunger had been declining for years, the trend reversed a few years ago as food insecurity levels began to creep up again, with military conflicts in many regions and recent locust infestations in East Africa being some of the major drivers," unquote. All right, two things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. You'll get free access to selected WPR articles all week long, as well as a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. Again, the URL is wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? Freddy, why don't you kick things off?
All right. You can either guess the leader this is about or even the country, if it's a little too hard. Here's the quote. "If all the TV channels say the same thing and all the newspapers have the same headline, you need at least someone who is making a joke about the president or the regime. And they find it in these outlets."
I don't know that one. I didn't see that one this week. Prachi, any idea?
I'm not sure. Maybe Venezuela?
Good guess, but this is actually about Egypt and Egypt's president, Sisi. This was a quote from a professor at Dartmouth, Ezzedine Fisher, in a New York Times article about critics of Sisi abroad in countries like Turkey and Qatar who are broadcasting YouTube channels, the kind of TV that is banned in Egypt increasingly and is often sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not even that critical of Sisi necessarily. Sometimes, again, it's just making a joke, but even that is effectively outlawed in Egypt now.
It seems like all these authoritarian strongmen have very fragile senses of humor and thin skin.
Definitely the most dangerous thing is if someone laughs at you.
Not me, but Sisi. What do you got this week, Prachi?
So this is a company commenting about work from home policies, so I think you can guess the company. Here's the quote. "The past few months have proven that we can make that work. So if our employees are in a role and situation that enables them to work from home and they want to continue to do so forever, we will make that happen."
I saw this an article in the New York Times about office space in New York and how people are reconsidering it. I want to say, Freddie, do you have an idea of the particular company? I've got a good guess. But.
Yeah, I want to say it's maybe Google or Apple, because I feel like I saw an article about how especially tech companies are basically trying to sort of outdo each other in terms of saying that they're going to be even more cautious about office conditions now and even more generous about work from home.
Yeah, I was going to go with Google.
Yeah, you guys are on the right track. It was Twitter in a blog post where they said that after the pandemic, work culture is not likely to be the same.
All right, I've got one and then a bonus one afterward. So here's my real Who Said That quote for the week. You can guess the country it's about or the country it's coming from. And bonus points also for the particular person who said it. So here's the quote. "It is no surprise to hear such things from people who recommend drinking disinfectants to ward off the coronavirus, to contend they are still a party to the agreement after officially leaving it."
Oh, I think I know who said this.
Go for it, Freddie.
I want to say I think it's about the Iran deal, and so I imagine if so, it's someone from the Iranian regime, because the Trump administration, I know, was trying to claim some conditions of the Iran deal that they want to now selectively still adhere to, even though they left.
You got it. It's the Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif. who's very good at political communication in English. He studied in the U.S., and he was commenting on the Trump administration's attempt to trigger snapback sanctions on Iran as part of the nuclear deal. The U.S. is seeking to extend an embargo on arms sales to Iran that will expire in October as part of the deal as well. The only sticking point is that, as everyone knows, President Donald Trump officially abandoned the deal in May 2018. So there's a little bit of a problem there. Here's my bonus quote. It's neither about a global leader or so it's unlikely you'll know who said it or who it's about. Maybe if you saw the story, you might know what it's about, but it's just too great to pass up. Here's the quote. "The man's a hero. Simple as that. Not all heroes wear capes, but this guy should."
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either.
It's a customer speaking about Peter Brown, the director of Forest Road Brewing Company in East London, who's turned his white van into a pub on wheels, driving around London to pull pints for customers at the curbside outside their homes. His van is painted with the slogan, "Tactical Beer Response Unit," on the side. Only in London.
That's amazing.
Maybe that'll be the future of bars everywhere.
It sounds like a pretty good idea. It's really cool looking too. The taps are on the outside of the van, and so he just pops out to the curbside, pulls a pint, and hands it over. People are apparently drinking it up.
I guess from now on you'll hear one jingle for the ice cream truck and another jingle for the beer truck.
I want to know the beer truck jingle for sure. All right, great stuff. Thanks, Freddy.
Thanks, Judah.
Thanks, Prachi.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.